Hello everyone, I'm Rysa Walker, author of Timebound. Much of the time, however, I'm also Dr. Cheryl Walmuth, a professor of history and government. Pretty much every historian I've ever known has secretly wanted to have a time machine. Not necessarily to change history, but so that you could go back and see how events unfolded without the inevitable bias and distortion that sometimes gets added to historical accounts. But would we be able to resist tweaking things just a bit to create a better world? I'm not so sure, and that's the basic premise behind Timebound. I've never gotten my time machine, and if my fellow historians have been luckier in that regard, they aren't sharing. But we do have a pretty decent fallback option. Primary sources are the next best thing to being there, not just for historians, but for fiction writers as well. And those of you watching this video are members of the first generation to have these sources literally at your fingertips. Only a few years ago, a researcher who wanted primary sources usually had to descend into a dark basement filled with ancient, crumbling books, or do battle with microfilm and microfiche readers that left you feeling queasy, like you just watched the Blair Witch Project. Today, there are dozens of archives online that bring these sources directly to you. No filling out call slips, requesting interlibrary loan, or carting around a huge stack of books. If you know where to look, a few keystrokes are all it takes to locate archives of excellent primary sources for your research. But before we begin digging around in those archives, what exactly is a primary source? And what makes a primary source different from a secondary or even a tertiary source? Let's start with tertiary sources and work our way back. A tertiary source is a reference work, like a dictionary, encyclopedia, atlas, or a textbook. For middle and high school research, these are usually acceptable sources, but always check with your teacher. Once you reach college, however, you'll be expected to rely mostly on primary and secondary sources in your writing, and use tertiary sources only for checking background information, looking up unfamiliar terms, and so forth. One particular type of tertiary source, Wikipedia, deserves special mention, however. Many Wikipedia articles are even more accurate than a traditional encyclopedia because they're updated regularly and include recent events. You could be getting cutting-edge analysis from a modern Einstein, but you never know. A Wikipedia article could also be written by these guys, and I'm not joking. They both posted to Wikipedia, and now that the oldest one has learned how to add footnotes, some of his stuff sticks around. As their mom, I think they're both pretty good researchers, but at 9 and 11, they really should not be considered expert opinion, except possibly on the Carolina Panthers. On that subject, these two can hold their own against anyone out there. A secondary source is any work that includes analysis by a writer. For academic research, there are good secondary sources and not so good secondary sources. At one end of the spectrum, we have peer-reviewed journal articles, sometimes called scholarly articles. This type of work is not only written by someone who is considered an expert in the field, but it is also reviewed by a panel of other experts in the field prior to publication. At the other end of the spectrum is a blog post. You know, anyone can have a blog. All you need is an email address and an opinion about something. Just because you see that someone writes a blog on history, international relations, or the sex life of snails does not mean that he or she is an expert in that field. If there are no credentials listed, skip it. The credentials won't guarantee that the author knows his or her stuff, but they will cover your own academic reputation. Okay, so now we've covered tertiary and secondary, and we come to the main course. What exactly is a primary source? It doesn't mean the main source that you use in writing the paper, although in many cases, having a primary source as your main source would be a good idea. Whether a source is primary depends very much on the area you're studying. For a scientist, a primary source might be raw data from an experiment. For a psychologist, it might be patient interviews. For a political scientist, it could be the text of a bill before Congress or a Supreme Court decision.
And I'll tell you one thing, the wild horses aren't going to drag me off this floor until those people have heard everything I've got to say, even if it takes all winter.
For a historian, a primary source can be a wide array of items from the period or event that you're studying. Newspaper accounts written during the era, speeches and interviews, videos of an event or a famous person, court transcripts, music, maps, art, photographs, even movies or television shows. The key is that they must have been created during the time that you're researching. So, a newspaper article that was written in 1926 about the Charleston craze is a primary source for the Roaring Twenties era. But a newspaper article written in 1926 about the Battle of Bunker Hill would not be a primary source for the American Revolution because it was written long after that war ended. And the television show Bewitched would not be a primary source for the Salem witch trials of the 1690s, but it would be a primary source for looking at changes in the role of women in the 1960s. A teacher of mine once summed up primary sources this way. A primary source comes straight from the horse's mouth. No filtering, no analysis. So if you were writing that paper on changes in women's roles in the 1960s, you wouldn't rely on a book that someone else had written about a TV series like Bewitched. You'd actually head over to Amazon or Netflix and compare an episode or two from the first season to an episode or two from the last season. For historians, primary sources are vital, but they are also very important for anyone writing fiction. Not just historical fiction, but any fiction that is set even partially in the past. Details are important, and digging into the primary sources can add depth and richness to your dialogue, your plot, and your setting. You could fake it, and some writers do, but readers can usually tell the difference, and it's so easy to check things online these days. Having a character drinking a Sprite in 1938, when it wasn't invented until 1961, shatters what Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the guy who wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, referred to as the suspension of disbelief. Basically, the reader's willingness to believe a story, even if it contains fantastical elements. If you make it too difficult for readers to suspend that disbelief, it's unlikely that they'll stick with your story. So finding good, credible sources of information is very important for a writer. And if those sources are from the period you're writing about, all the better. For example, my novel, Timebound, is science fiction, but there's a time travel element. The main character, Kate, has to travel back and repair the timeline. Her destination is the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, also known as the Columbian Exposition, or for short, the Expo. One of the things I enjoyed most about writing this book was investigating the many primary sources on the Expo in 1893 Chicago that are available online. All of these images were from a single online source, archive.org. And if you're looking at more recent history, especially the era between 1930 and 1960, the selection at archive.org is even better, with a vast array of TV shows, commercials, educational films, newsreels, and music. Google Books is another excellent and underutilized source. What would a 17-year-old girl wear to the Expo in 1893? How would she style her hair? Wouldn't it be nice if you could pull up the 1893 edition of Elle? Actually, you can, or at least you can pull up the equivalent. Google Books has many vintage magazines online, including Godey's Ladies Book and The Delineator, a popular fashion magazine for the style-conscious 1890s woman. Maps also provide valuable primary source data. There are dozens of detailed maps of the fair that gave me a good idea of the walking distance between the various locations and the sights that one might see along the way. For the exposition, maps from the time period are really all that are left. Aside from a single permanent building and some bridges, all of the buildings that you see here were demolished a few months after the exposition ended. Even the world's first Ferris wheel was eventually torn down. It was a gargantuan ride designed to outdo the marvel of the previous World Fair in Paris, a tower by Monsieur Eiffel. While it wasn't quite as tall as the Eiffel Tower, this puppy could move, and it held up to 60 riders in each of the 36 cars. The images that you see here are from a project by the Urban Simulation team at UCLA. This group has made wonderful use of the many maps, drawings, and photos of the exposition, creating a simulated walkthrough of many sections of the fair. These were an excellent resource that helped me to get a real sense of the layout of the exposition. Sometimes I felt like I'd actually been there, and that makes it easier to give the reader a vivid description. The other primary source research wasn't quite as much fun as a trip to the fair, unless, of course, you're into serial killers. Kate has the misfortune to encounter Dr. H.H. Holmes, who is stalking young women at the exposition. Holmes, whose real name was Herman Mudgett, was known as quite the ladies' man. Apparently, bushy mustaches were all the rage for dashing young men in the 1890s. Holmes roamed the fair with 3 young children who were visiting him, handing out advertisements for his World's Fair Hotel, which catered specifically to female travelers. Holmes was also responsible for the architectural design of the hotel, and the neighbors thought it odd that he hired and fired so many construction workers during the project. Apparently, he wanted to ensure that none of them could connect the dots and start asking why a hotel needed to have trapdoors, cremation ovens, and airtight rooms with just a tiny hole for piping in gas to asphyxiate his guests. Holmes was eventually caught when the bodies of the children who had been visiting him were found and the evidence traced back to Chicago. No one is quite certain how many women he killed during the fair. Estimates range from around 50 to as many as 200. It's hard to have a precise count because he was pretty ingenious at disposing of the evidence. The basement of the hotel held a lime pit and a furnace for cremating the bodies, and as a physician, Holmes also had a booming side business, selling fully articulated skeletons to medical schools and colleges. Seems no one bothered to ask him where they were coming from. Holmes's trial was a national sensation, and thanks to the primary sources, diagrams of the hotel used in the court case, newspaper reports, and an excellent book by the head detective on the case, it was much easier for me to get the information I needed concerning the details of the hotel and Holmes himself. One problem with research is that it can sometimes take hours to comb through websites to find just the right sources. And I can be a bit like this little guy.
He made me this color so that I may talk. Squirrel!
If I see something cool and click on it, then I click on something else, and soon an hour has passed and I'm looking at some movie from the 1980s on IMDb with absolutely no clue how I got there. One research technique that can help you stay focused is to find good secondary sources about your subject and work backwards. Many books have bibliographies and notes that can direct you to good primary sources. I used an excellent book about the exposition, Devil in the White City, that was written by Eric Larson, which is also scheduled as a major motion picture with Leonardo DiCaprio as Holmes. The detailed footnotes in Larson's book led me to many of the primary sources that I used in writing Timebound. It was still important to track down those primary sources when possible, however, because they often contained additional details. For example, Devil in the White City didn't have the diagram of the hotel that I was looking for, but one of the many primary sources that Larson used when writing the book did include those images. The next book in the Timebound series, tentatively entitled Pendulum Pass, will have Kate stopping very briefly in several places, including Boston 1905 and Dallas 1963. But the primary setting for Pendulum Pass is Athens, Georgia, 1938. Why 1938? One reason is that the sources available for the era are truly incredible thanks to the Great Depression. If it sounds odd to think an economic disaster, remember that there were a lot of jobs created as a result of the New Deal, which was Franklin D. Roosevelt's program designed to jumpstart the economy out of the Depression. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which was one of the New Deal programs, resulted in the construction of the interstate highway system, public libraries, and many other public works projects all around the country. But construction workers and other blue-collar laborers were not the only people who needed employment. White-collar workers, teachers, secretaries, writers, lawyers, lost their jobs as well. Artists were also unemployed, and all of these individuals had families who needed to eat as well. While it's tempting to say that the government should have handed them a shovel and let them do some manual labor, there simply weren't enough of those projects to keep everyone busy, and it probably wouldn't have been the best use of their skills. So the WPA thought about other areas where these workers' talents could best be used. Arts projects ranged from the very large, like the creation of murals and large public statues, to the funding of individual photographers like Dorothea Lange, whose iconic images of average folks trying to cope with personal tragedy are synonymous with the Great Depression in the minds of many people. The Federal Writers Project was another program that gave white-collar workers a job. One arm of the program aimed to create travel guides to each of the states, with the goal of increasing tourism as the economy regained strength. The travel guides created by the WPA give interesting commentary on the social culture of the 1930s. The staunch segregation of the South, for example, comes through loud and clear, both in the guides themselves and in the letters between the WPA workers in the South and those in charge of the program. Some of those who were employed were actually writers and journalists, including John Steinbeck, Saul Bellow, Zora Neale Hurston, John Cheever, Ralph Ellison, and Eudora Welty. If you haven't heard of any of these yet, you will. You might even like a few of them. And these are just the names we remember because they go on to become well-known writers and end up in American literature textbooks. Most of the folks on the FWP were unemployed teachers, secretaries. In some states, this basically meant anyone who could write a coherent sentence and needed a job. And what they left behind is a staggering collection of material. The folklore program of the WPA went around and collected ghost stories, superstitions, and traditional tales. Others brought in audio recorders to capture musical performances, and there are even a few video clips to show traditional dances in the African American communities of the Deep South.
I just get in the crowd with the people, and if they sing it, and I listen as best I can, then I start to joining in with a phrase or two, and then finally I get so I can sing a verse, and then I keep on till I learn all the songs and all the verses, and then I sing them back to the people until they tell me that I can sing them just like them.
The Federal Writers Program also conducted interviews with thousands of average people around the country, including hundreds of former slaves who were still living in the 1930s. These interviews provide us with rare first-hand narratives about their experiences under slavery and during the decades after the Civil War. And aside from the tremendous store of materials that the FWP provided to historians in general, it also provides me with a great setting for a time travel book. If you were a time traveler who wanted to observe history and talk to average people about their lives, what better cover story than the FWP? Newsreels and newspaper stories about this federal program meant that people weren't all that surprised to have strangers pop up on their doorstep and ask them to give details about their day-to-day activities and their memories of the past. My Chronos researchers would have been able to simply blend in with the real WPA historians. Or would they? A member of the Chronos team would be looking back more than 300 years in their past. But even from our current vantage point, a little more than 70 years later, there are many things that would be strange in 1938. This is also a useful thought experiment for any writer or researcher thinking about the way that we analyze the past and the various preconceived notions that we bring to the study of history. Think for a moment about the challenges that you would face as a researcher today if you found yourself in 1938 Georgia. Technology is obviously different. Most of those interviewed had running water, but quite a few didn't have electrical power in their homes. A radio was a prized possession. Television was still more than a decade away, and the internet or cell phone would have been unimaginable, except perhaps to writers of fantasy and science fiction. Education has changed dramatically as well. In 1938, only 2 out of 10 in most southern states would have graduated from high school, and the average white citizen would have stopped around the 9th grade, with the average African American student stopping around the 6th grade. There were compulsory laws passed around 1920 that required attendance until age 16, but they were frequently not enforced. Social norms may be the biggest change, however. If you are African American, you'd encounter a very different environment. Bathrooms, water fountains, and other facilities were segregated by race throughout the South, and as you can see from these 2 water fountains, they were separate but far from equal. Lynching was still a very real problem, and any hint of an interracial relationship, or pretty much anything else that made a white mob angry, could result in death at the end of a rope. A female time traveler landing in 1938 would see that women now had the right to vote, but many other rights were still a work in progress. For example, a married woman in South Carolina had no legal identity separate from that of her spouse. The Georgia legislature had just resoundingly defeated a bill that would have allowed women to sit on juries. Women would not win that right in Georgia until 1953. In the neighboring states of Alabama and South Carolina, juries would remain all male and also all white until the mid-1960s. So if many of these things seem very different from our perspective less than a century into the future, how odd might they seem to someone traveling several centuries further? Having a cell phone in your pocket, if you went back 400 years in our own past, could easily have gotten you burned at the stake for witchcraft.
She's a witch!
The savvy time traveler would need a good understanding of the period before going, and the best way to learn how people dress, talk, and interact with others in society is to dig into the many primary sources that are at our disposal. That's also sound advice for writing believable fiction, and if you would like to try your hand at it, the Cronus Files blog is taking student submissions. There's also an ongoing contest with prizes that are detailed on the website. Thanks for allowing me to visit with you today, and enjoy your time travels.